Hello and welcome to all of you. We're so pleased to have you join us for today's webinar, Be Better at Managing Conflict Under Stress. My name is Jennifer Overbow. I am the MBTI Product Marketing Manager here at CPP, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. If any of you are new to us, CPP is the exclusive publisher of the Myers-Briggs assessment, as well as other instruments, such as the Thomas-Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, or TKI, which are used by organizations and professionals around the world to improve people performance. Today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last 15 minutes reserved for Q&A. If you have a question, please go ahead and submit it via the questions box, which is located on the right side of your screen. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we will address as many as possible during the allotted time, so don't worry. We will also respond to those after the webinar that we're not able to get to during. As with all our webinars, today is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording in just a few days, as well as a copy of the presentation slides, and we'll post the recording to our website on cpp.com. Today's speakers are, first, Dr. Ralph Kilmann, and then followed by Dr. Sarita Bhakuni. Ralph is CEO of Kilmann Diagnostics, a firm dedicated to resolving conflict throughout the world. Previously, he was Professor of Organization and Management at the Katz School of Business, University of Pittsburgh, for 30 years. Ralph is an internationally recognized authority on systems change and has consulted with numerous corporations worldwide, including AT&T, IBM, Ford, GE, and the U.S. Office of the President. He is co-author of the Thomas-Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument and several other diagnostic assessments. He has extensively published both books and articles on such subjects as conflict management, organization design, problem management, change management, and quantum organizations. Ralph, welcome. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your very nice introduction. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share my perspective on conflict under stress. Here are the topics I'll be covering in my 30-minute presentation. As you see, I'll first acknowledge the increasing levels of stress that people are now facing in both their personal life and vocational life. Then I'll present a model that highlights how different levels of stress affect performance, which I've dubbed the rat and people model. As you'll see, sometimes we act like human beings, and other times we act more like rats. Just so you know, I make this rather dramatic distinction so you'll never forget the key points of this webinar. Next, we'll see how I've used the TKI Conflict Model and modified the TKI Instructions so I could learn how people respond to conflict under different levels of stress. In fact, modifying the instructions to the TKI is a good way to zero in on how conflict is handled in any very specific situation. Finally, by combining the rat and people model with the 5 conflict handling modes, you'll see the importance of helping people sustain moderate stress, neither too much nor too little. Even if you first thought that the ideal scenario is to eliminate stress altogether, it actually turns out that the very best way to achieve high performance and satisfaction, whether for an individual, a work group, or a whole organization, is to maintain moderate, stimulating levels of stress. In my conclusion, I'll suggest how we can do things to stay within that moderate range of stress, because it is in this zone that we'll be able to spend most of our time being fully human and thus very conscious and very mindful of all our behavioral choices, especially how we resolve conflict. And please keep one thing clearly in mind throughout my presentation. As stress increases, ordinary conflicts can quickly turn into big, messy conflicts, which costs everyone a lot of grief and costs organizations a lot of money. Here are some of the facts of life in the workplace today. We should be well aware by now that we live in an interconnected global village. what happens on the other side of the planet can affect us and our organizations overnight, perhaps even in just a few days. And basically, it makes us feel out of control. This adds stress. So in the past, when we would be concerned about our local region or our country at the most, now we have to realize that anything can happen anywhere. Of course, this can be physical, such as an earthquake, a tsunami, perhaps a nuclear meltdown, or it can be an economic event or a financial event. But knowing that these events are out of our control even more than before adds stress to all our lives. As a result, I think we've lost some faith and trust in our organizations. Basically, we wonder if they have what it takes to survive. Like us as individuals, they can no longer control all the events on the planet. We are now vulnerable. Feeling vulnerable makes us anxious about the future, creating stress. And because of the recent downturn in the economy, naturally people fear losing their job. And if they do lose their job, are they going to be able to get another one? This causes stress. And we've often seen in workplaces where certain employees are laid off or retire, and because of the economy, they're not replaced. And then the remaining employees are expected to do all the work. This adds more stress. So the bottom line question has to do with how does such increased stress affect both individuals and organizations? Here now is the Yerkes and Dodson model, developed in 1908, which was done making use of rats, mice, pigeons, and other animals. In fact, in that era, experimental psychologists used animals to study how we learn, how we behave, how we resolve conflict. It perhaps wasn't until the 1920s or 30s then there was this big surge of interest saying, if we want to understand human behavior, particularly in the workplace, maybe we should make use of human subjects and study how human behavior actually takes place on the job. Now, what I have dubbed the rat and people model is an integration of what Yerkes and Dodson found, coupled with what we have learned on motivation theory in the past 50 years. So on this model, we see increasing performance and increasing stress, and we notice this upside-down curvilinear relationship. Basically, the research on rats found what works at the extremes, in the end zones, in the very beginning, before things start moving along, and towards the end when we get into overwhelm. So, for example, the experimental psychologist would put a rat in front of a maze, and this rat would be hungry, and so the rat was motivated to find some food. There'd be some food at the end of this maze, and so the rat could smell this food. The drive level, that's the D here, is the amount of arousal. How hungry is the rat? Perhaps the rat hadn't eaten for several hours, and so now the rat is motivated to find food. The habit is how well has the rat learned the maze. The first time around, the rat bumps into the left wall, the right wall, eventually arrives at the cheese or the food pellet, and then does it again and again, and eventually it becomes a conditioned response. Performance is then based on this equation. The arousal state times how well the habit is learned is how quickly the rat will run through the maze. This was proven again and again. However, some of the experimentalists went to the extreme, which brought us into this realm over here. And that is when they tried doing this with rats that hadn't eaten for days or perhaps for a week. Perhaps today this research could no longer be done because of all the animal rights issues, but it was done at that time. And then they found that the rat was too weak to run the maze. The other thing that some of the experimentalists did, again this was 100 years ago, is attach electrodes to the rat's brain and then produce an electric current which stimulated the rat to run the maze. But if there was too much current put through the electrodes, the rat would be again in this zone, would freeze, would become immobilized, would be paralyzed. And that accounted for this curvilinear relationship. Now, in studying human behavior, we have found that people work best in this realm. where they can use their cerebral cortex. They can use all their talents and gifts mindfully, thoughtfully, consciously. And this equation here, M times P times I, is based on contingency theory, also called expectancy theory, that people make choices depending on the situation, how they read the situation, and then they choose what to do. The M is the particular thing that people want, which is far more than just satisfying hunger. The P is the probability. They look at the situation, how likely is it that I will be successful? The I, the incentive, what will I get? Either extrinsic rewards or intrinsic rewards. But the point is, people are viewed as mindfully making these choices and deciding what to do next and how to be creative to achieve what they want. We just don't think of the rat in front of the maze having an inner dialogue that says, gee, I wonder if the size of the cheese is as much as it was yesterday. I wonder if they're putting in some other kinds of cheese. I wonder if they changed the maze on me. I wonder if this will be a challenge today. Maybe I want to do this another time. And even if I'm hungry now, maybe I'll get into this delayed gratification and wait for a little later to eat. We just don't think of the rat as having that kind of dialogue, any of the animals, in fact. So if we want to be fully human, we have to recognize that we need to be up here. And of course, the point of this model is sometimes we act like rats and sometimes we act like people. Think of when you get up in the morning. Sometimes people use an alarm clock. That's that external stimulus that shocks your system. Not quite like an electrode, but maybe close. And then maybe you take a shower. Maybe that wakes you up. Maybe you have some caffeine through coffee or tea. And maybe, like that old commercial for the men's aftershave, you slap yourself in the face and you say, I needed that. So you're somewhat awake, and then you drive to work. Maybe some of you have realized when you enter the parking lot, my goodness, I don't even remember driving to work. I was on autopilot. I did it out of habit. I was aroused enough to get to work, but then I habitually drove my car. Of course, you hope that if another car pulls out, you'll quickly know what to do, or if there's traffic, you can mindfully find another route to work. But basically, we often find we are on autopilot, just much like rats. But then when we get to work, we hope we can be very mindful. And that's when our higher cognitive processes take over until we get to this point where stress, too much stress settles in and we feel overwhelmed. And based on the increasing levels of stress that I noted to you in the world today, more and more people are operating in this zone. And I've interviewed many in my work with organizations, and more than ever before, because people are asked to do more with less, they spend most of the day stressed out, they come home at night exhausted, and I assure you they don't handle conflict very well. They get angry, they yell at people, they're condescending, they're demeaning, they don't answer phone calls, they don't attend meetings, they are overwhelmed, and then they become like a rat again. When I present this to organizations, we talk about what does it take to spend most of our time in this moderate zone of stress, where we can be fully human. And you'll see in a little bit, I will show you exactly how that can be done. Now, let's take a look at conflict behavior, because these are the kinds of choices we have to make day in and day out. And essentially, conflict is whenever your wishes are incompatible with someone else's. This happens every moment of the day, particularly with our diverse workforce, with all the challenges. We are forever and ongoingly managing conflict. Now, I should say that the Thomas-Kilmann conflict model, which Ken Thomas and I developed, was implicitly designed for moderate stress. I'm not saying we made a conscious decision, but I think our assessment and most other assessments assume that people can mindfully respond and are responding about situations when they are being fully human. That's a very interesting assumption. But let me walk you through the standard TKI conflict model, and then I will suggest how you can look at it under different conditions of stress. We have these two dimensions, assertiveness and cooperativeness, which define these 5 conflict modes. Assertiveness is the extent to which you try to get your needs met in a situation. Cooperativeness is the extent to which you try to get someone else's needs met. And on this rather large space, I want you to keep this image in mind. On this large space are plotted these 5 standard conflict modes, which have been around since the 1960s, even if they sometimes used different words and phrases. But they became solidified with the TKI in the early 1970s. So very briefly, competing is when you assert yourself to get your needs met and you're not at all concerned about the other person. And if you read the situation, you might say, my needs are right now, this issue is very important to me. It doesn't appear to be that important to the other people. I have more knowledge than they have, so this is the time for me to assert myself. Accommodating is where you focus on getting the other person's needs met. And you may read the situation and make the choice and say, right now, this is much more important to you than it is to me. And essentially, I want to give you the opportunity to learn besides. And maybe you'll remember that when I gave in to you, when things are very important to me, you'll also reciprocate and let me have my way. But this is all very, very mindful. Compromising is somewhere in the middle. We both get our needs met to an extent, but we really don't dig into the issues. This may be where we don't have a lot of time, and the issue may not be vitally important to both of us. It's only somewhat important, so we choose compromising. That's a very mindful choice. It's expedient. It works well under certain situations. Avoiding is the case when we say, right now, it might be best not to discuss this further. Maybe we need to collect more information. Maybe I'd like to talk to a few more people before we make a decision. And maybe a decision isn't necessary now, so let's not force the issue. And it's possible that maybe after we discuss it, we find out it's not that important anyway, so let's move on to topics that are more important. So avoiding can be done very mindfully, very effectively, again, under the right conditions. And lastly, collaborating, by far the most complex conflict mode, because a whole set of conditions have to be in place before collaborating works effectively. You have to read the situation and be able to assess, is there sufficient trust? Will people really share what they need and want? Is this an issue that's vitally important to both people? Do they have communication skills? Can they listen to one another effectively? Does the culture support taking the time to have an open, thoughtful dialogue? Are people able in this zone to be creative? Does the reward system support people taking the time to develop win-win solutions? And under the right conditions, being very mindful, people can achieve outcomes that satisfy everyone. But again, if those conditions I mentioned aren't met, we won't be successful. Now, what I have done is shown you here the typical TKI instructions. And these have been around since the early 1970s. And people are put in this frame of mind. Consider situations in which you find your wishes differing from those of another person. How do you usually respond? We don't specify the situation. We somehow ask people to think about all situations in general to get at their typical response to conflict. And then, with these instructions, they're asked to respond to 30 pairs of items, A-B choices, where the A and the B is a different conflict mode, so they choose which one they're more likely to use. And then basically we score the results. People find out which modes they might be using too much or too little. They get their profile. Now, what I learned many years ago is it's advantageous to often change the instructions so they are more in line with the specific situation you have in mind. For example, many times in working with organizations, when the focus is how do we resolve conflict in this organization, in this work group, on this cross-functional team, I change the instructions. I ask people to respond. In your work group, in this organization, on this task force, when you find your wishes differ from those of another, how do you respond? And I ask people to keep those modified instructions in mind as they respond to all 30 items. Then they're not thinking about other situations like the family, the neighborhood, the last organization they were in. They're focused on this organization, this work group, and therefore the results are more accurate. I've done the same for looking at stress. In fact, in the early 1980s, when there was a lot of deregulation going on in the airlines industry, in the healthcare field, in the utility field, in the financial field. In fact, in the early 80s, that was the wave of developing open markets across the globe and deregulating organizations and industries that had been pretty well regulated in the past. And so there was a lot of stress in the workplace. How are we going to face this new world? We're used to being utility. We were controlled. We didn't have to worry about our market. It was captive. Now we have to compete. What do we do? So basically, I modified the TKI instructions to represent 3 levels of stress. So the high stress, the instructions would be, when you are feeling stressed out and overwhelmed, how do you usually respond? For moderate stress, I just didn't use our general instructions. I wanted those people to really focus on how they respond to conflict when there is moderate stress. And this is how I worded it. When you are feeling attentive and thoughtful, how do you usually respond? And then for low stress, I worded it this way. When you are feeling peaceful and serene, how do you usually respond? I should mention that it takes about 10 minutes to respond to the TKI. It may even be less. And so even if you ask people to respond to 3 different instructions, always asking them to keep these instructions in mind, then essentially in 30 minutes they could respond to all 3. Now often I just do 2, like the high stress, the moderate stress, or I do instructions like in this organization, outside this organization. But I wouldn't do more than 3. It gets rather tedious, people get bored, and essentially they remove themselves from responding to more items. But 2 or 3 generally work well. Now let me show you what happens to the TKI model under high stress, and I've experienced this again and again. The high modes are competing, avoiding, and accommodating, and both compromising and collaborating vanish. They are just very, very low. And as I did more research on this, I recognized that when people are under very high stress, their parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to protect themselves from all this stress and overwhelm. And people decide very unconsciously how to respond by either fighting, going against something, fleeing, moving away, or freezing, which is the ultimate moving away, where you go so deep inside you shut down. In fact, you can't even run away from the situation. You are frozen. So fight, flight, and freeze become substitutes for competing, avoiding, and accommodating, because those labels are used to represent mindful choices. We compete, we assert ourselves as we read the situation. We're not responding like a rat. When we compete, we're making deliberate choices. Same for avoiding, same for accommodating. But under very high levels of stress, we become like a rat, and then it's fight, flight, and freeze. Interestingly, the ultimate freeze is basically playing dead. And if in fact there's an antelope that's being chased by a tiger, and first the antelope perhaps instinctively realizes they're not going to fight, they're going to lose that one, so they try to flee. But typically the tiger can chase them down. Their last response is freeze. Pretend they're dead. Maybe the tiger will say, well, I can go back to this one later. I can now go after another antelope. And once the tiger is gone, perhaps that antelope who's playing dead can recover. But this is in our limbic system, in our mammalian brain. We're using that part of our brain. We're not using the cerebral cortex. Let me now show you 3 slides which capture visually what's going on here so you will remember this. Perhaps it's easier to find a picture of a sleeping lion as opposed to a sleeping rat. So again, it's really any animal. But look at this lion. This lion is at peace, not motivated to hunt for food or to fight or to walk around and enjoy the neighborhood. This lion just wants to sleep. In fact, here's the comical way I put it. If you walked up to this lion with a TKI, the lion is likely to say, don't bother me. I'll take the TKI when I'm awake. Okay, that happens under very low levels of stress. Under moderate levels of stress, look at this photo. Now, to me, this is like a projective test. I don't know this person. I don't know the situation, but this is how I'm reading it. This person is being very mindful. In fact, you can see the coffee here, or at least the coffee cup. Maybe that person had a little coffee to get into that middle zone of moderate stress. And now the way I look at that person, very thoughtful, very mindful. What am I going to do? How do I analyze the situation? I've got a conflict here. How do I present this to others? How am I going to manage that? I got to come up with something. But in that mode of being mindful, that person is using the best of their cognitive abilities. Here is a cartoon that shows the ultimate high stress, and you can see everything around this person is just overwhelming him. In fact, this person might appear to be in a frozen state. You see the phone here. Maybe the person just got off the phone. He was yelled at by his boss. Maybe he's going to turn around later and yell at his spouse, or maybe yell at his dog, and he may displace that stress. Or he may flee. He may look at the watch and say, it's already 4 o'clock. I'm going to get out of here. I can't take it anymore. And we go into fight, flight, or freeze, just like the rat, when we have to protect ourselves from being overwhelmed. But I assure you, and this point should be clear by now, if people in organizations are spending most of their time in fight, flight, or freeze and acting like rats, we are not making use of our human potential, and the conflicts in the workplace are going to turn messy. We're going to hurt feelings. We're not going to get our work done, and it's going to cost the organization a lot. Under moderate stress, however, we recognize that we can do what we want to do to the height of our abilities. Normal tension is good. I might mention that part of this webinar is to bust the myth that it'd be best if there was no stress in the situation. And to me, that's almost like the myth that it would be a better world if there was no conflict at all, as if that would be the goal. I assure you, if there was no stress and no conflict, we'd all be dead, because human systems, the biology of the human body, needs tension. That's how it develops, that's how it grows, that's how it functions. The question is, how do we keep it in a moderate range of stress so we can resolve our conflicts effectively and efficiently for our own benefit and of others? We actually refer to, in the literature, normal anxiety. Normal anxiety is not zero anxiety. It's a level that gets us aroused, gets us to work, and gets us moving. And levels of engagement are determining how our thinking is. Is it sharp and active, or does it get stuck and frozen? As we move into organizations, we recognize the impact of the organization as a whole being under moderate stress and all the good things that can happen, as opposed to being so low in stress that people are on autopilot. They're just going through the motions. They're waiting for something better to go along. They're doing the minimum to get by. They're not going to survive in today's world. At the other extreme of rat-like behavior is so much stress that people can't think clearly. They harm one another. They hurt one another's feelings. They can't listen. Everybody's talking in a group meeting. You can't be creative. You can't compete in today's world. So essentially, we know that employees can do their best when there's moderate stress so they can manage conflict effectively. And let me emphasize the second bullet. Employees have time and space to treat other people with care, sensitivity, and respect. I assure you, under high stress, people do not treat one another very well. But it is under moderate stress where they can apply what they've learned in all those workshops and training programs on communicating effectively, active listening, conflict management. They can apply everything that they've learned. In fact, I might emphasize, this is not just for the TKI. Now, perhaps I should have said this earlier. Any assessment that is taken under stress or is reflecting the assumption that it only works for moderate stress is not getting at the issue of what's going on in the workplace when, in fact, people are mostly in a state in today's world of high stress. Now let's look at the corporate culture, which is above and beyond the individual employees. And here we have the case, does the culture support moderate stress? In fact, the culture you might define as those unwritten rules of the game, how things are done around here, How do we approach one another and our job in this organization? And there's some organizational cultures that support and encourage people pausing, reflecting, discussing, considering before they dive into action. Other corporate cultures, you're supposed to be busy at all times. The effective employee is the one who's so busy. You wear that busyness like a battle scar. You show people how busy you are and you have no time for anything, as if that's a positive. But again, if you're in that high zone of high stress, you're not performing at your best. We look at teams in organizations, and I look from the outside as an observer, and if I'm finding that everyone's talking at the same time and there's no pauses, no one can be listening, this team is not making use of its talent. So just think of this. If you look at a team, are there pauses? Is there an opportunity for people to reflect without always talking? Is there only one person talking or many people talking? And finally, we know that an organization will retain the best members and attract the best people if they have this healthy, human workplace, not rat-like. As I mentioned before, if things are so peaceful and so quiet that basically people are just getting by, going through the motions, being on autopilot, no creativity. Or at the other extreme, organizations have reputations. You want to work there, you're going to be exhausted at the end of every day. Long hours, a lot of stress. That does not allow people to be human. Let me have you recall the rat and people model. And I mentioned we want to extend this middle area. And this is what allows us to be at our best. And look at this next slide. It has basically, by going back and forth, you can see, expanded that middle range. The question is, how do we do that? How do we move quickly to be human and to maintain that in the face of stress? And that brings you to the last slide of my part of the presentation. And here's some strategies I've learned. They're so simple, but they're so effective. You've got to stop, pause, and relax. You've got to catch yourself when you find yourself running around like a chicken with its head cut off. That's the rat model. Breathe slowly and deeply, relaxation. In fact, this is where meditation comes in, or Tai Chi, yoga, any exercise that has you breathe and relax and feel it in your body. Perhaps you can remind yourself of when you've been very successful and very happy. Remember that feeling. That will often put you right back into that moderate zone. Then you can visualize what you really want, need, and go after it with expectancy theory as opposed to drive by habit. And then you can choose the best conflict mode for the situation because you have the time and the mindfulness to read the situation and make the best choice. On my last note, I will simply say that a great group exercise is to expand this list by asking people, once they've seen the rat people model and its implications, to consider how do they get into that moderate zone and how do they stay there? What are some techniques? These are the ones that are typically listed, but there can be many, many more. It's a great group exercise. This concludes my part of the presentation, and the next part is for Sarita.
Great. Thank you so much, Ralph. And I want to remind the audience we're getting a lot of great questions, so please continue to submit them, and we will get to those at the end of our presentation. Next, we have Dr. Sarita Bhakuni. Sarita is a licensed psychologist, senior organizational development consultant, an assessment expert, and a trainer of CPP's MBTI and CPI 260 certification programs. She has vast experience in a wide range of industries, including healthcare, technology, retail, and education. Sarita works with organizations to develop training programs, deliver team building programs, implement career development initiatives, create diversity empowerment programs, provide coaching, and in outplacement and selection. Welcome, Sarita. I'd like to turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. I want to start by just quickly going over some of the content that I'll try to cover in our remaining time together. You know, one of the things I find so valuable is when we have a wealth of information, either about individuals or groups that we're working with. And I find a lot of synergy between the MBTI and the TKI. There's a lot of opportunity for the two instruments to have a conversation in a way and help us arrive at some positive conclusions and productive actions to take. I'll talk a little bit about type dynamics. When we have so many people attending, I want to pay attention to the breadth and depth of experience that people have. We may have some people early in their MBTI use, and we may have some expert certified users. So I want to just address that briefly. I'll talk a little bit about the grip experience, which is one of my favorite things about using type in terms of catalyst for change. A little bit about conflict and style, and to wrap up, being your best. So let's take a look at our next slide. And here, it's important to remind ourselves of how the preferences complement modes. And quickly going through 4 preferences: extroversion and introversion, where we get our energy and how we refuel during the day. Extroverts refuel by interacting with others and energizing through their environment. Introverts refuel by spending some time alone reflecting. Sensing and intuition, ask the question, what are the kinds of information that we know and trust? People who prefer intuition enjoy theories and themes and vision big picture, where people who prefer sensing like concrete, exact, precise information and details. Thinking and feeling has to do with the way we make decisions. If we lead towards thinking, we likely make our decisions logically. Understanding causality is part of our decision-making process. If we make our decisions towards feeling, it's likely that we integrate who's going to be impacted. And finally, judging and perceiving has to do with how we organize and orient ourselves in the world. If we have a joy of closure, it's likely that we like to plan ahead and organize and structure our time. If we have a joy of process, then it's likely that we like to act spontaneously, and that's the perceiving preference. Our type is very dynamic with 4 different levels. We experience type in dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior modes. And when we're thinking about how these preferences interact with modes, I love the way that Ralph described the absence of competing and of compromising and collaborating, those modes that vanish. And a similar thing happens with type when we're under stress. Our dominant and auxiliary functions are those ones that we have the most easy access to. It's the dominant function is the one that comes most natural to us. And the order of our functions has to do with how easily we can access and how comfortable we feel using those functions. The 2 middle functions of any type are our functional pairs, and they help us understand implications of type. So for example, the sensing and thinking functional pair. In conflict, those people really focus on precision and accuracy of their stance or the argument. They want information to be represented correctly, and it's not really personal in the middle of a conflict. It's about the information and how it's shared. For the sensing and feeling functions, those people really want information, how it serves people, and they really want to be heard and respected in those moments, and they do feel things personally. For the intuitive feelers, they want information to move people forward for development. They desire harmony, and they want a win-win situation. And for the intuitive thinkers, the most important element during a conflict is competence. They're involved in the strategy and looking at the best case scenario, but they're really not taking it personally. They're addressing it in a blunt way, maybe possibly directly. And so when we think about functional pairs, they really do. You can see some similarities between the modes. With the TKI and the MBTI, I think one of the most important things we can remember, as Ralph alluded to earlier, is the appropriate use. Regarding the situation, how can we best use our type to be most productive and functional, and how can we best enter into or out of TKI modes to help us understand better in conflict situations. As we move to the next slide, we can see that in our grip preference, our functions change. Naomi Crank wrote this great book about 10, 12 years ago about, and coined the phrase in the grip, speaking to our inferior function. And when we see our inferior function, we notice that we really are tapped out. We're out of gas. We really have lost our energy. And in terms of being at an energy level, which is fantastic to operate during stress or during conflict, we are not there. So what happens is we forget ourselves in a way, and to use Naomi's phrase, we're beside ourselves. We're working long hours, we're not getting anything done. We're acting in ways where we don't recognize ourselves, and we behave in a way that later we really regret. And typically, our functions order in dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and then inferior. But when our grip function comes out, it's a sign that we're doing too much, that we're not taking care of ourselves, that we're in too much conflict or stress. The goal is to get back to our dominant function and to be present, to pay attention to what our inferior function is telling us. Similarly, in that way, we can move within fight or flight or freeze to determine what the appropriate mode is or what the appropriate solution is to manage the conflict most effectively. So let's take a look at conflict and style. As I alluded to, our functional pairs, they really contribute to our approach during conflict, and how we flex those preferences, it's really much harder to do when we're in the grip. If we keep our eye on the target of what we want our outcome to be, we can get a closer look at which is the mode that's going to help us be most productive and get to the closest possible outcome that can benefit yourself and others involved. When we're in the grip, it's harder to do this. Our vision is stalled and it's tunnel vision. So it's harder for us to see the needs of ourselves and the needs of others. If we pay attention and understand which functions are introverted and which functions are extroverted, we can start to notice this behavior, and it's basically telling us that we need to pay more attention to what's happening around us. And that idea of presence, Peter Senge writes beautifully about presence and how when we have presence of mind and presence of thoughts, then that's when we make more significant decisions and they're more mindful. So managing the moment really is key during a conflict. Finally, when we have that idea where we're trying to be our best, we want to come from the best parts of ourselves during any kind of conflict. So as Ralph said earlier, using that normal amount of tension to enhance our functioning, leaning into the discomfort. If we find we lean into a conflict, there's often opportunity on the other side, learning of ourselves and learning from others. And the goal really is to come from the best parts of yourself, using your dominant function, operating your auxiliary function, and paying attention to what the inferior function is telling us. As with most of our growth and development, our key really is self-awareness. And the more self-awareness we have, it becomes such a currency for our develop that if we pay attention to that, our development can really continue enhancing. And if we look at what the MBTI and the TKI can tell us about both of those things, we really have a lot of opportunities to learn how to travel within the modes for the best situation and how to use our preferences and flex them appropriately so that hopefully we can enter into a conflict feeling well equipped, that we will have at least our voice heard, and even though we may not get what we want 100%, that we will advocate for ourselves and really for the best scenario.
Thank you, Dr. Bhakuni, for talking us through a little bit about how the TKI and MBTI interact and can be used to help an individual understand their stress response. We've received many, many questions from the audience. So before we get started on Q&A, I wanted to just let you know that we are offering a special promotion on the 2 instruments that we discussed today, along with some of the support material. So we do here at CPP have a new MBTI stress management report that just came out. There is also a booklet that will help individuals understand their type and their stress reaction to it, and that is called the In the Grip booklet. We're also offering a promo on the tools that Dr. Kilmann discussed, including the online TKI profile and interpretive report, as well as the self-scorable booklet, and then 2 of the client booklets that are aimed at helping your clients better understand their conflict mode and how to apply the appropriate mode at the appropriate time. So without further ado, I'm going to launch right into Q&A, and we'll see how many of these we can get through today. The first question I'd like to ask is basically for both Ralph and Sarita to answer. And perhaps, Ralph, you can start by offering your response. the question is, can you offer a tip on how to deal with a team member who has high stress and is holding back the team from being effective?
Yes. If it is primarily one person, and whether I'm the consultant or the leader of the group, I would recommend having a separate conversation with that person. I only address it as a whole team when, in fact, there is stress throughout the team, and therefore it affects everyone. And in this coaching counseling session, and I've done this many times, that I would make use of the RAT people model. I would show what's going on, and maybe the person can identify some internal and external stressors and get some self-awareness that way. I might even recommend some techniques, forms of meditation, exercise, breathing, relaxation responses, because unless we get each individual in the team in that moderate tension mode, we're not going to get the best use of every person there. Sarita, do you have some things to add?
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment, Ralph, and also say, you know, my question is often, what is it going to cost the person to change? If their behavior is not effective, what is it going to take for them to change? And is it going to cost them more to change or not to change? And what is it going to cost the team? And just to have an assessment of, is it likely that that person has the energy and will divulge the energy that's necessary to make those changes, to have a realistic assessment of that first, and then move into, you know, what's the effort and motivation, and start with those evaluations.
Great, thank you. The next question is really for Ralph, and it's a two-part question, Ralph. This individual is interested in first understanding how they can tell what level of stress a group is under. So sort of what are the signs that a group is under a high level of stress? And then the person also wants to get your thoughts on whether or not you believe that most organizations are under a high level of stress at most times.
Very good. First, I would again mention that when I observe groups, it's a question of how many people are talking at once and if there are any pauses. I think I mentioned this during my presentation. That is such a powerful sign. In fact, it works with any two people. If they're constantly talking over one another, no listening is going on, and to me, that's typically, it's not just a question of not having the skill to communicate effectively, it's also a question of there's just so much stress, they can't listen, they're just talking, it's repetitive behavior. Again, it's the symbol of a chicken running around with his head cut off. It just can't perform. And so those are the signs. And yet, if a group is under lower stress, there are pauses, one person is speaking, and guess what? Everyone else is listening. In terms of organizations today, I certainly haven't done extensive research in all industries, but for the companies that I have been working with, yes, there's more stress now than ever before, and people will report, if you get them into a one-on-one conversation, that they are stressed out. Perhaps they're also getting ill. They have headaches. You see the consequences in their family life. We have to find a way to alert organizations that to make the best use of their people, their most valued asset, so to speak, they have to keep people in that moderate zone, and constantly putting pressure on people to perform more is no different than putting pressure on a rat through some kind of external stimulus.
Great, thank you, Ralph. We have another question that I believe is a great question. I think a lot of folks in the audience are interested in hearing both of your thoughts on this. Perhaps, Sarita, you can start by answering this question. If a situation causes a high level of stress, when is it okay to sort of let that go? And I think this is a question that people are asking in terms of probably themselves, it sounds like, the way they're framing these questions. If I'm constantly exposed to a situation and it always causes me a high level of stress, how do I know that it's time to just let that go, or to try a different path, or to extricate myself from that situation? And how can I go about doing that?
It's a great question. Well, I think there are a few elements of that question that I would consider. One is it the situation that you're in, and what can you own in that situation? I think there are times when people are in situations and they walk away maybe without completely exploring what the options are, what the possibilities are in terms of changing or shifting their perspective or behavior. And then guess what? They go to a different company and they find themselves in the exact same situation. I see this so often with teams and with individuals. And so I would ask the person to really evaluate their part in it. Have they done everything to completely understand their contributions? And if given the situation, they have owned what they're responsible for, tried to change what they can in the situation, but the situation simply is not going to change, then I think, yeah, in terms of self-preservation, sometimes it is better to walk away, to let go of it, and to look for an opportunity where your talents will be considered or where you can work more productively. So at what point do you make that decision? I think if you've done a thorough self-evaluation of what you can own as a part of the situation, and if you've done your part to shift your perspective and to try and attempt to have a more productive either relationship or situation.
Yeah, I can certainly add to that notion of taking personal responsibility for your own growth and development. I have worked with some companies and we've made use of more unconventional techniques, if you will. And these involve some form of meditation, yoga, tai chi. There are many modalities that are available that have to do with growing mindfulness and you becoming aware of the own signals you have in your body which are telling you, I'm in overwhelm, what do I do? And I have found that people who meditate, and let me emphasize, meditation merely means focusing on one thing with all your exclusive attention, whether it's your breath, whether it's a spot on the wall, whether it's a song, whether you're humming something, whether it's a chant. And in that process, you become awakened to the sensations in your body, which will then tell you, wait a minute, I'm in overwhelm, I got to stop, I got to make a better choice. And in that way, maybe you're less likely to go to another job, another organization, and wind up attracting the same stressors, which put you into the same reactive mode. So again, with personal development, personal responsibility, you say, how am I reacting? Why am I reacting? What can I do to sort of better understand my reaction so I have greater choice? That is all about personal responsibility and self-awareness.
Great, thank you. This next question is for Sarita. Sarita, you specifically talked about leaning into conflict for the purpose of growth. And this person would like to know if you have any more thoughts on tools to use to help different types do this.
Okay, so the question is how to lean into the uncomfortable space for depending on your type?
Yes. How do you help folks lean into conflict? You know, not be scared of conflict and deal with it for the purposes of growth. And okay. Are there certain activities or things that you might suggest as tools to help a person become more comfortable with that, with experimenting and developing that side of themselves?
Yeah, there's an exercise that I've used with both individuals and with teams, and it's just called What If. And in a conflict, I ask people, let's say it's a person with a sensing and thinking preference, then I ask them, what if you had an intuitive and feeling preference? How do you think you might approach this conflict or conversation differently? What if you had an intuitive and thinking preference? And I'll ask them to look at some of the opposite preferences and other preferences so they can start to imagine what other people with other functional pairs, how they might approach this. And really what I'm trying to do is develop some empathy in that situation. And when people have more empathy and more self-awareness in that situation, it's a less scary place to be. So leaning into the discomfort means, you know, a lot of people are uncomfortable with ambiguity. So it's finding something familiar in the unfamiliar by just exploring those possibilities with that what if exercise, giving people an opportunity to dialogue, and then somehow, in some situations, not with everyone, but it becomes less fearful for people to imagine adopting a different perspective.
Great. Thank you, Sarita. I have to get to this last question. There are just so many questions. So I think this one is a good one for both of you to address. It's coming through in many different formats, but I'm going to do my best to summarize. If you have a specific individual who is stressed, how can you help that individual handle confrontations without going into fight, flight, or freeze mode? So they're having chronic levels of high stress right now. How can you help them handle confrontations that arise when they're feeling high stress without going into a fight, flight, or freeze mode? And perhaps, Dr. Kilmann, you could start by answering this one.
Sure. I think the first step, and this is part of an educational or experiential process, is for this individual to learn what are the signals when I am in stress and I'm in overwhelm. How do I feel it in my body? Is it my blood pressure? Is it my head? Do I feel the blood rushing? Do I feel pale? Is there anxiety in my stomach? The first step is knowing when you're in that zone and then knowing the steps to get out of it. There must be some relaxation. You have to take a step back. If you want to move away from fight, flight, or freeze, you got to move into the mindful zone. How do I do that? Breathe deeply. This sounds so simple, but they're finding in the medical profession, in the healing professional, if you can get people to breathe slowly and deeply, they return to being human. But they don't know what to do that if they're running around and they don't catch it. So again, step one, we have to learn to identify and honor the sensations in our body which are telling us we are not thinking clearly anymore, we're stressed out. Step two is use those techniques, practice them, to breathe deeply, to focus on some object, to think about a good time, to change your perspective, so then you can approach the conflict using the 5 conflict modes as designed, not fight, flight, or freeze. But you've got to catch yourself, and you take the steps to approach things mindfully.
Yeah, I would add that self-care definitely comes first to do the things that Ralph talked about. I also use a pretty quick assessment of how severe is the conflict and what's the impact, and it's just called the 30 rule. And I break increments of time down into 30. Whatever the conflict is, whatever the stress is it going to matter in 30 minutes? Is it going to matter in 30 hours? Is it going to matter in 30 days? Is it going to matter in 30 weeks? If it's not going to matter in 30 minutes, then it's not worth your energy. If it's going to matter in 30 hours, you have to enlist your coping resources and strategies to help you get through the next day. If it's going to matter in 30 days, you've got to ask for help, because you're going to need some support. You're going to need some additional vision to move yourself through that challenge. And definitely, if it's going to matter in 30 weeks, you're going to have a team of people to help you to move through whatever that conflict or stressor is.
Great, thank you so much. And we've come to the end of our webinar today. We still have many questions, so I just want to let everyone know we will get back to you. If we were not able to address your question, we will follow up with you one-on-one via email. I want to thank both Ralph and Sarita for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. And I want to let all of you know that today's presentation was part of TPP's 2011 webinar series on organizational development and thought leadership. And we are going to have a follow-up webinar, a Putting It Into Action focused webinar on June 7th that will focus on tips for managing conflict under stress using the TKI and MBTI assessments. So for those of you who have questions about how to actually use those assessments, both alone as well as together, we will address those questions in our next webinar on June 7th. But I'm going to go ahead and say thanks to all of you for joining. Hope you have a fabulous day, and hope you'll join us again. Thanks so much.